All right, so earlier I told you that if we set a source here, this will be interpreted as a URI. And that's why we cannot use embedded images in XAML. For that, we need a markup extension, something like this. Let's call it embedded image. And here we could have an attribute like source and set this to the resource ID of our image. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to create a custom markup extension. First, as a best practice, I'm going to go into Solution, right-click the portable class library, add a new folder, and call this markup extensions. Now I'm going to add a class here, just an empty C# class, and call it embedded image. We don't need a constructor. Now this class should implement an interface called iMarkupExtension. And this interface is defined in Xamarin.forms.xaml namespace. Now when we right-click this and implement it, we get one method here, provide value. Inside this method, we should return an image source. So I'm going to go in our code behind and copy this line back in our markup extension, return something like this. Now we have a red underline here because we need to resolve the namespace for image source, which is Xamarin.forms. Now there are a couple of things we need to do here. The first one is that we want to make this dynamic. So instead of hard coding this resource ID here, we want to pass it as a parameter. In our XAML file, I've used the source property for that. Maybe it's better to change this to resource ID. That's cleaner and more explicit. Now we go back to our markup extension and define a public property called resource ID. And then instead of hard coding this string here, we can simply use this resource ID. Now, what if this resource ID is null or an empty string? What if a future developer forgets to provide one? We need to check for that. So if string is null or white space of resource ID, we're just going to return null. So this is all we have to do to create a custom markup extension. Now, when it comes to using this markup extension, we go to our XAML file. In Xamarin Forms, we do not have a markup extension called embedded image. So we need to put this in our own namespace. We need to prefix it, something like this. By convention, we use the local namespace for any types that we define in our application. So local : embedded image. Now we need to register this prefix in our XML file. So our content page element has a couple of XML namespace declarations that you have seen before. This one is for Xamarin Forms, and the other is for Microsoft XAML. Now I'm going to add another XML namespace declaration here. So XML namespace : local. Now here we have a special syntax. For the types that we define, we use CLR-namespace : and here we add one of the namespaces in our application. In this case, we should add the namespace in which embedded image class is defined. So you can see this class is currently defined in Hello World namespace. If you're using Visual Studio, when you add this class inside a subfolder like markup extensions here, Visual Studio will use the folder name as the namespace. But in Xamarin Studio, that doesn't happen. So in this case, I'm going to go back in our XAML file. And for the CLR namespace, I'm going to use Hello World. Now, if this namespace happens to be in a different assembly, we need to specify that here as well. So we add semicolon, assembly equals, and here we set the name of the target assembly. In this case, Hello World. But we don't really have to do it now because this XAML file and our markup extension are in the same assembly. So to make the code cleaner, I'm going to remove this. Now, one last step to make this code a little bit cleaner. We can make this resource ID what we call the content property for embedded image. And that means we can exclude it from here and simply add the resource ID. How do we do that? We go in our markup extension, apply an attribute here called content property. And here we pass a string called resource ID. All right, so this is all about using embedded images in our application. Next, I'm going to talk about platform-specific images.